I know when I spoke to John Waters about his experience from the time that he made Pink Flamingos and his experience of the queer community at that time, and then his experience now. And I wondered what your experience was at that time, so the 70s, late 60s, 70s, compared to now, and the differences.
Well, I think the first thing one would have to say is both he and I are now a lot older.
Yes.
I think this is important because often it's very hard to disentangle the fact that one is older from any sort of objective assessment of how things have changed. I mean, clearly there wouldn't have been any sense of a queer community back in the 70s. The word wasn't used. It was the beginning of, well, not really the beginning, but certainly the growth of gay and lesbian politics in ways that had to deal with a very, very different social and cultural environment to the one that now exists. That is, we're talking about Western liberal democracies. It's unfortunately not at all different if we're talking about the situation facing people in many other parts of the world. And it's hard to disentangle the overall changes from the particular changes, so that there's a lot of nostalgia that I hear from people of my generation that I think is rather misplaced. And I think people veer between a sort of triumphalism and a regret for a lost past. And I'd really rather avoid both of those if I can. I think the reality is all sorts of things are different, and you can't separate what is different for someone who's queer from what is different in general in the society. The 70s were a period when many of the issues that seem now to be overwhelming weren't around. I think that young people today are much more precarious, much more pressured financially, and people are living in we've already talked about this, a very different media environment. And, if we go back to the question about social media, I think one of the great things that social media does is it enables people who are isolated, either because of where they live or disability or family and communities they're part of. It gives them access to a much bigger world. And for someone who's just coming out as lesbian or gay, that is actually enormously important. So that when people bemoan, as they sometimes do, and maybe John Waters did, I don't know, the death of a lot of traditional queer culture,
Yes.
I think that has to be balanced against the fact that actually that wasn't available to everybody. And the internet has made things accessible to vast numbers of people who would never have had access, who would never even have known there were other people like them out there in the world.
His point was around saying that he was just happy that people had the option to get married, have children, things that didn't really exist. So there are extreme things. You talked about bars and things that, even he, known for his shock value, things that shocked him. And he said the community's changed in terms of becoming more options around those other things as well, if people choose it.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And there certainly are more options. And part of it, again, it takes us back to media. When I was growing up, there were virtually no depictions of homosexuality available, except in a few not very easily obtained novels. Now, of course, it's virtually obligatory for every soap opera to have a couple of gay characters. There are very public, prominent figures. And we have someone like Penny Wong, who in some ways is probably the most admired Labor politician in the country, an open lesbian married with kids. I think those changes are really important and enormous, and I certainly don't want to underestimate them, and at that stage I'd say, I think the changes have on the whole been quite extraordinary and pretty good.